Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you back to the channel as I continue to trawl through the history of fighting games, to bring you lucky people deep dives on some of the most popular, some of the most forgotten and obscure, and some of the most fascinating titles out there. This time out we'll be revisiting the fantastical, mythical and extremely combo heavy world of Killer Instinct, as we examine the history of 2013's reboot that attempted to capitalise on the success of one of the most beloved coin-guzzling arcade machines of the mid-90s. In today's video we're going to look at, was it a justifiable and worthy successor to the immensely popular series of yesteryear, or was it just another cynical ploy to capitalise on extremely profitable 90s nostalgia? Come join me as I try to find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Killer Instinct 2013. Yeah! Looking back now, it's difficult to appreciate just how impactful the first Killer Instinct was in both the arcades and within the fighting game community. Developers Rare could essentially do no wrong at the time and were fast becoming the darlings of the industry at that point. After being well established for many years, churning out solid, varied and respected but ultimately not massively noteworthy titles, people really started to stand up and take notice of the British devs internally after the Battletoads series blew up. While this was the case, it was 1994's Super Nintendo masterpiece Donkey Kong Country that elevated them to legendary status in both fans' and critics' eyes. The hype for the game was astounding, and it had one of the biggest marketing campaigns ever seen in the video game industry, causing borderline Donkey Kong Country hysteria. Despite the fact that Killer Instinct had actually launched to American arcades a few weeks before the release of Donkey Kong Country, it was very much seen as Rare's successor to the immensely popular SNES platformer, so expectations for the development team's official first entry in the tournament fighter genre was almost unrealistically high. Thankfully, those clever little British boffins were almost as adept at programming fighting games as they were at making quirky platformers, and their novel take on the genre was an instant hit. Incorporating pre-rendered sprites that absolutely blew the tiny primitive minds of the inhabitants of late 1994, far more detailed character animations than had been seen in fighting games previously, and a combo system unlike anything that preceded it, Killer Instinct both looked and played like a mid-90s dream, and by the summer of 1995 it had received over 500 million arcade plays and multiple home ports. This was just the beginning for the juggernaut that was Rare, as they continued to churn out beloved hit after beloved hit throughout the rest of the 90s and into the early 2000s. Almost unparalleled in their success for a company of that size, the next 7 years would see them release the likes of Donkey Kong Country 2, GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark and Conker's Bad Fur Day, just to name a few. An already successful relationship with Nintendo, established during the NES and Super Nintendo life cycles, became even more successful after the transition to the powerful 64-bit behemoth known only to us mere mortals as the N64. Or maybe the Ultra 64 if your memory is really that good. With such a preposterous partnership between the two parties, one would presume it would be prudent to persist with such a profitable pairing, but astoundingly, Rare only ever actually released one game for the entire lifespan of Nintendo's 6th generation console, the GameCube, that being 2002 Star Fox Adventures, which, although well received at the time, strayed too far from the Star Fox formula to be very fondly remembered. Despite this, Star Fox Adventures ended up being a big seller for the system, and it appeared that Rare even had the backing of Shigeru Miyamoto, as it was him that personally requested the British devs handle the project. This kind of support from within the company meant that many insiders expected Nintendo to purchase shares in Rare to ensure that the partnership would continue. But shockingly, no deal or offer ever emerged, and it became evident Nintendo had no desire or intention of backing the company financially at all. It seems a rise in development costs and a desire to increase focus on in-house studios were factors behind the Big N's decision, but no real concrete answer has been given as to why no purchase ever came, and this is a subject that has caused much speculation over the years. Even Rare's co-founder Tim Stamper was at a loss to explain why the partnership fizzled out, and a deal was never struck, stating, "I've no idea why they didn't do that. I thought we were a good fit." Meanwhile, the corporate giants over at Microsoft were in the process of getting ready to start work on their swanky new 7th generation system, the Xbox 360, and they were in a position to start throwing wads loads of that sweet Bill Gates cash all over the development and promotion of their new exciting hardware. With the Rare team somewhat in limbo following their Nintendo snub, Microsoft decided now was the right time to swoop in and attempt to purchase them, which they eventually did for a cool $375 million, after pricing out Activision and making Rare a first-party developer for the company, not a fee to be sniffed at. I think perhaps Bill Gates is the first person to make more profit from Windows than George Formby. With such an exciting new partnership emerging, with fresh technology on the horizon, and finally some real committed financial backing, hopes were high for the future of Rare software under the Microsoft umbrella. It seemed almost inevitable that things would go from strength to strength for them, but it didn't take long for the proverbial wheels to start falling off. In fact, their first Microsoft game, released for the original Xbox, though very immaturely and not particularly amusingly named Grabbed by the Ghoulies, was considered Rare's worst effort to date. Not the start that one might hope for, and it didn't really get too much better from there. Disappointing sales, lack of advertising and marketing, particularly compared to other in-house developed Xbox 360 releases, key members of the dev and management team leaving to pursue other opportunities, and a clear dwindling faith from Microsoft in the once mighty British company gave little cause for positivity around Rare at the time. Even relatively well-received games such as Perfect Dark Zero and the Viva Pinata series were considered disappointments by the Microsoft overlords due to their poor sales performances, and so the decision was made to have the company's focus be shifted to developing games for the fledgling Kinect add-on. Quite the depressing fall from grace, really. Once considered one of the most innovative and seriously bloody creative developers out there, Rare were now being reduced to churning out what would basically amount to Wii Sports knockoffs. Oh dear, oh dear. The news of another new Microsoft console, the Xbox One, being almost ready to hit store shelves gave the poor depressed little buggers over at Rare some hope, as a project to revive one of their most popular IPs from the 90s had been greenlit as a launch game for the new system. Killer Instinct was finally going to get a new iteration. There had been quite a bit of interest in bringing Killer Instinct back from the dead for a number of years from several Rare employees. These included well-respected Microsoft Studios director and original Killer Instinct designer Ken Lobb. So in 2012, Microsoft applied for renewal of the Killer Instinct trademark, and those proverbial wheels from before were back again, but this time in motion rather than falling off. Unfortunately, Rare's cause for celebration wasn't quite as big as first hoped, as it seemed Microsoft's previously established lack of faith in them was still prevalent, and they would only have Rare overseeing development, with assistance from Ken Lobb, with a lion's share of the work going to little-known Californian studio Double Helix Games. It was clear from the off that Double Helix wanted to make sure they had a good, solid fighting game pedigree, and there were a lot of credible people in the field working on the title. Notable names from both the development and competitive side of the fighting game communities were brought on board, such as respected tournament organiser Adam Hart and former Capcom employee and Weapon Lord creator James Goddard. Why they couldn't have gone with Killer Instinct 3, Killer Instinct HD, or any other more sensible name you could think of is beyond me, but the confusingly titled Killer Instinct was released as a free-to-play game, with all game modes available, but only one selectable character to pick, to coincide with the launch of the Xbox One in November 2013. In a rather ingenious marketing ploy, the one character that is available to select in the free version would rotate at timed intervals, giving grotty little impoverished peasants that couldn't afford all the characters the chance to try new ones out for themselves, provided they keep coming back to play the game at specific times. Extra fighters were released according to seasons, similar to what we've seen with recent Street Fighter games, including various extra outfits and further online content for individual characters. The game itself made use of the all-new Hex engine, which was based on the previously established and very metal sounding Slayer engine, and although capable of a wide variety of functions, was specifically made with fighting games in mind. The mastermind behind this new engine was the previously mentioned James Goddard, who is a bit of a fighting game legend by all accounts, and the man responsible for Champions Edition of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. Double Helix's main goal early on was to understand exactly what made the original Killer Instinct a success, and vehemently stick to that formula, whilst also making a product that would appeal to modern sensibilities. They concluded that the series was established on a foundation of bombastic audio and graphical effects, an almost bombardment on the senses of sight and sound with insane announcers screaming at you every time you do anything half decent, extreme violence and absolutely ridiculous combos that are simply way more over the top than in almost any other fighting franchise. The fact the game provided such an authentic Killer Instinct experience based on those factors was seen as one of the biggest positives during the first season, and it ensured that old school fans of the series were very much on board right away. Despite the game not actually starting out as an Xbox One title, with tentative development beginning on the 360, Double Helix and the Hex engine made excellent use of the new hardware, with Killer Instinct being an absolute treat on the eyes, chock full of stunning visual effects, impressively fluid animations, and a blistering and extremely steady frame rate. For such an early Xbox One title, it's quite a technical marvel really. The soundtrack is similarly well done, with some of the most intense, pounding metal riffs this sound of the Doom reboot, alongside some of the more memorable hooks and tracks from recent memory, providing an incredibly fitting backdrop, with every piece of music feeling like it matches its setting perfectly. Gameplay is tight and fun with a perfect blend of simplistic and easy to get into it, but also deep and difficult to master, with each character playing differently but still feeling well balanced. Reviews were similarly positive, with the only real enduring criticism of the game being directed towards the lack of content available on launch, and initial lack of any serious story mode. The general consensus seemed to be that if these issues were rectified, we could have a bit of a classic on our hands. Speaking of classic, many of the franchise favourites of yesteryear were back, with 1994 iconic characters such as Jago, Orchid, Fulgore and more all seeing a return, with even a new character being brought into the mix known as Sadira, who has been ordered to assassinate other competitors in the competition. The somewhat bumpy road and not insignificant amount of adversity that Killer Instinct had faced on its way to being released would continue, as just as the game was finding its feet within the ever-demanding fighting game community, developers Double Helix would get some dirty Bezos money thrown their way, as they got bought out by the capitalistic pig dogs over at bloody Amazon of all places. This would leave the future of the game in great uncertainty, as there were still several more seasons of characters and vast amounts of content scheduled to be released yet. Supposedly, staff at Double Helix were gutted about having to abandon the project, as it was so personal to them, and apparently held out hope that Microsoft would counter Amazon's offer in an attempt to keep hold of them. But that offer never materialised, and the dev team were left disappointed. I'm sure the massive stacks of evil spacemen Bezos' cash they were now sitting on cheered them up at least a little bit though. To heroically save the day, in stepped those bloody lovely people from fledgling studio Iron Galaxy to take control of the project and attempt to get the rest of those seasons out, as well as continue to update and support the game in lieu of Double Helix's acquisition by Amazon. It was seen as a huge risk on the part of Microsoft to entirely hand over the reins of the project to a completely different studio on the other side of the country, but the Chicago-based Iron Galaxy CEO, Dave Lang, actually went so far as to fly a team of devs out to Double Helix's offices in California for a full week to learn exactly how to use and get the most out of the Hex engine. Most insiders assumed that handing the project over from one team to another would be a disaster, as things of this nature usually are. But the commitment shown by Iron Galaxy and the fact that Double Helix clearly wanted to see the game succeed as well, and were doing everything they could to aid in the process, meant the transition was an almost seamless one. Many classic fan favourite characters from the original game were set to be added, as well as several totally new ones, and Iron Galaxy vowed to not only maintain the expected high standard on all of them, but also expand and refine several of the gameplay aspects Double Helix had established in Season 1. It seems that their commitment to the product paid off, as despite having a fraction of the amount of time with the engine, many consider the seasons of Killer Instinct that Iron Galaxy were in charge of to be superior to Double Helix's efforts. Due to their hard work, the game would be hugely expanded upon, and the roster would be tripled, adding tons of new characters and returning greats too. In a surprising twist, even Rash was added to the game, one of the heroes from the Battletoads franchise, who had previously helped put Rare on the map. Without Battletoads, there would be no Killer Instinct, so this was a lovely nod. As if the small Chicago studio's workload wasn't crazy enough, they were also presented with the daunting task of porting the game over to Windows, Steam, and making cross-network play between both platforms possible. In spite of their relatively minuscule budget, they actually managed to not only succeed in this endeavour, but also do a much better bloody job of it than several far better financed games. Network play for Killer Instinct is often lauded as one of the best online experiences you can have with a fighting game. Seriously, impressive stuff. It's hard not to consider 2013's Killer Instinct a success, particularly given all the obstacles that were thrown in its way. It really was positioned to be a game that could not possibly succeed, but as is evidenced by its sustained popularity, the overall quality of the product, the demand for multiple physical versions of the initially digital-only title, and the fact that it literally headlined several high-profile fighting game tournaments, it's undeniable that it did. The press have had a lot of nice things to say about this game, with IGN stating, "Not only is its combat system flashy and well thought out, it's well explained too, thanks to its powerful training tools, and what is easily the most complete guide to terminology and tactics ever assembled in a fighting game. Killer Instinct delivers where it counts." GameSpot would write, "Killer Instinct successfully updates the 90s classic into a finely tuned competitive fighter that can stand alongside the genre's regulars. Its muscle-bound roster conveys a satisfying sense of weight and force with their movements, while still feeling responsive to your commands. There is a lot of flexibility in combo authorship, but the combo and counter breakers help keep both fighters on their toes even as the hit count rises." By Season 3, praise was still being lumped on the game, with Destructoid writing, "Since its release, Killer Instinct has slowly become one of the most competent fighters in the genre. It's accessible at all levels thanks to its approachable yet deep combo system and extensive tutorials. Its characters, including the new ones from Season 3, all have unique mechanics and tons of small touches that bring them to life. With an efficient and non-scummy free-to-play model and PC availability, there are few reasons not to jump into Killer Instinct." There is no doubt by this point that Killer Instinct was a success. Many gamers adored the return of this class and continue to wish for even more. Despite this, Microsoft have been more cagey than a TNA Lockdown pay-per-view about whether there will be a new game, or even any further updates, with barely a whisper about Killer Instinct in over 4 years. But given that we're extremely early in the current generation of consoles' lifespan, and there had previously been a 17-year gap between Killer Instinct games, there's still hope. So who knows what's next for the franchise's future? Overall, ladies and gentlemen, that was the history of 2013's Killer Instinct game and its tumultuous journey to deliver great content. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out my videos that I uploaded on the older Killer Instinct games. I have plenty of fighting game history content for you to peruse on this channel. Videos like this are in part made possible by the wonderful people who back this channel on Patreon. Speaking of this, special thank yous go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Imar Sr., Ron Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Namph, Azaraki, Dropkin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Sana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Stitz, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs what I do on the Patreon platform. As the legendary King of Pop, Michael Jackson would say, thank you very much. Cheerio.